She jumped into the pool to save the billionaire's child. An hour later, she was fired. He said, "You shouldn't have been there," not knowing how it would turn out for him. See how one truth destroyed an empire. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The sun rose over the Drayton estate like it did every morning, gracefully, without asking for permission, casting golden beams over marble pillars, glass balconies, and perfectly trimmed hedges. The early light caught on the blue-tiled edge of the Olympic-sized pool, glinting as if even the water had been rehearsed to sparkle on cue. Inside the east wing, just past the staff kitchen and down a narrow hallway, where daylight barely dared to enter, Amalia Brooks stood in front of the mirror, tying her hair back with quick, practiced fingers. Her uniform was starched and clean. The white collar had a small tear at the seam unnoticed by anyone but her, and the black apron she tied around her waist still smelled faintly of starch and lavender detergent. She had been up since 5:30, same as every other morning, though today wasn't like the others. It was the day of the Foundation's annual gala, the event of the season for the elite of the state. It would draw senators, celebrities, donors, and executives from companies Amalia had only ever heard of when wiping down their product boxes in rich people's pantries. She checked her teeth in the mirror clean, her hands steady, her expression neutral, composed. It was a face she had perfected, one that neither invited attention nor showed discomfort. Her job depended on it. Blending in, staying silent, being invisible in the house of glass and gold where she did not belong. The other maids were already bustling. Berta was ironing the napkins for the dessert service. Louisa polished the serving trays until they reflected like mercury. Amalia passed them silently, heading to the kitchen to begin her assigned duties: glassware, garden tables, drinks. She passed by the pantry where the staff's schedule was taped to the wall, noting her name beside a color-coded block that marked her presence during the cocktail hour. That meant being in full view, passing hors d'oeuvres, keeping her back straight, and not making eye contact unless spoken to. She exhaled. Today she would not be seen. That was the point. Past the hedge along the main walk of the estate, black cars began arriving just as the morning haze lifted. Chauffeurs opened doors for women in silk and men in tailored suits. Security staff with earpieces nodded discreetly, barely blinking. As the guests entered through the colonnaded foyer, Amalia stood by the back terrace, arranging champagne flutes on a silver tray that weighed down her wrist. In one of the far lounges, she glimpsed William Drayton, owner of the house and its legacy, speaking into a phone with the controlled intensity of a man who hadn't heard no in decades. His voice never rose, but his expressions, tight mouth, narrowed eyes, told the story well enough. He walked past the terrace without acknowledging any of the staff. That wasn't unusual. Mr. Drayton's attention had a price, and those wearing aprons were not worth it. Amalia returned to the kitchen just in time to see a familiar figure passing along the hallway toward the patio. A little girl in a white cotton dress, barefoot, her hair still damp from a morning bath, Clara. She moved with a particular rhythm, not rushed or curious like most children, but inward, searching. Her hands moved slowly, as if counting space. Amalia's stomach clenched. The child shouldn't have been out alone, not with the chaos of the upcoming gala. But she knew that Clara often escaped the grasp of her nanny, who frequently complained that the girl doesn't listen, even if she could. Clara never spoke. She had been diagnosed with autism and partial hearing loss, conditions that her father acknowledged with polite words at board meetings, but largely left to hired professionals. And yet Amalia had always noticed something different about the girl, an awareness, a quiet defiance, a gentleness the world didn't seem to deserve. Amalia opened her mouth to call out, to alert someone, but protocol stopped her. She wasn't permitted to speak to guests or family members unless addressed. She watched as Clara disappeared around the corner of the terrace toward the pool area. Amalia's fingers gripped the stem of the glass she had just polished. She told herself to keep working. Keep working. Someone else would notice. They didn't. By noon, the estate transformed into a scene from a magazine. Soft jazz floated from hidden speakers, white tents shimmered in the breeze, and servers in coordinated black and white uniforms glided like shadows. Amalia moved among them with calculated grace, balancing trays, dodging elbows, replenishing tables. Her path brushed the outer edges of the social galaxy now orbiting William Drayton congressmen, oil magnates, fashion designers. She heard laughter, clinking glasses, the occasional, "Don't we all need a tax break?" But over it all, she heard a single sound that didn't fit. A splash. It wasn't loud. No scream. No shouting. Just a break in the smoothness of sound. A wet, accidental sound. Amalia turned. From her position near the bar table, she had a clear view of the pool. And there, sinking slowly, limbs slack but eyes wide open, was Clara. No one moved. A woman gasped, hand flying to her pearls. Another backed away, muttering something about her shoes. A young man in a blazer took out his phone, but not to dial for help. No one moved. Amalia ran. She didn't think. Her tray crashed to the ground, sending glasses flying, champagne spraying across marble. She shoved past stunned guests, her feet pounding against the hard surface as she reached the edge. She jumped. The water closed around her with an icy violence. In the clarity of the deep, she saw Clara's dress ballooning around her like a flower. Amalia grabbed the child, pulling at her stiff limbs, searching for the strap of the flotation belt. It had twisted, trapping her against the chair. Amalia yanked. The buckle snapped, and she kicked upward with everything she had. They broke the surface. Someone shouted. Others ran. Amalia dragged Clara to the pool's edge. A hand reached down one of the guests, finally breaking their trance, and together they lifted the girl out. She coughed, sputtered. Her body convulsed and then stilled. She was breathing. Amalia, soaked, trembling, pulled herself out, collapsing onto the marble. Her lungs burned, her eyes stung. But Clara was alive. Then came the silence. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was the kind of silence that falls when something unexpected ruins the script. William Drayton emerged from the crowd. His eyes went not to his daughter, but to Amalia. "What the hell is this?" he said, voice low but vibrating with fury. "Why is the staff in the guest zone? Who allowed this?" No one answered. Amalia tried to speak, but he didn't look at her. "You!" he snapped, eyes locking onto her as if she were a stain on his floor. "You're dismissed. Immediately." A few guests glanced away. No one intervened. The spectacle had shifted, and now it was an inconvenience. Amalia stood dripping, silent. A maid approached and whispered that she was to leave through the back gate. Her belongings had been packed. Hours later, her shoes still damp, Amalia stood outside the estate walls, her world reduced to a single plastic bag and the echo of her employer's final words. "You shouldn't have been there." But she had been, and because of that, a child lived. The street outside the Drayton estate looked the same as always. Polished pavement, trimmed hedges, and iron gates that gleamed in the early afternoon sun. But for Amalia Brooks, the world had shifted. The marble pool, the gilded hallways, the towering windows, they were no longer part of her life. Her shoes squelched with every step as she walked away from the only job that had kept her family afloat. A plastic bag hung from her hand, filled with hastily packed belongings and a folded uniform she would never wear again. The silence behind her felt final. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her legs carried her to the nearest bus stop by habit. Her blouse clung to her skin, heavy with chlorinated water. She wrapped her arms around herself, ignoring the stares of passers-by. A child in a stroller pointed at her. His mother pulled him close, whispering something as they passed. Amalia stared ahead. She had jumped into a pool to save a child. She had done what no one else had the courage or decency to do, and somehow she was the one being escorted out. When she reached her apartment complex, the familiarity of the peeling paint and the cracked tiles of the stairwell felt like a relief. The small third-floor unit she shared with her mother and younger sister was dimly lit, but warm. Inside, her mother, Delilah, was resting on the couch, her feet propped up on a cushion, a thin blanket draped over her legs. She had been battling high blood pressure and fatigue for years, working as a laundress until her body gave out. Now, Amalia was the provider. The moment Delilah saw her daughter, soaked, trembling, and with a plastic bag in hand, she sat up, alarmed. "What happened?" she asked, her voice cracking with worry. Amalia said nothing. She walked into the tiny bedroom she shared with her sister. set the bag down, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled, but her eyes remained dry. Her sister Maya, 16 and still in her school uniform, peeked in from the hallway, eyes wide. "Did they fire you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Amalia nodded. "Why?" "She said it was because she jumped in the pool," Delilah answered, having heard enough from the hallway conversation. "To save someone, right?" Amalia nodded again. She removed her shoes and peeled off the damp socks. Maya stepped inside, sitting beside her. "The girl, she's okay?" Amalia finally looked up. "She's alive." And that was all she said for the rest of the day. By nightfall, the apartment felt too small, too quiet. News of the gala was already circulating on social media. A photo of William Drayton giving his speech. A quote about the future of American philanthropy. Not a single mention of the girl who had almost drowned. Not a single word about the young woman who had saved her. Amalia scrolled through the photos with numb fingers. She found an online tabloid article that referred to a minor disruption during the event that had been handled swiftly by staff. There were no pictures of her, no names. It was as if she had never existed. In one of the comment sections under the article, a user had written, "Staff trying to get attention again. Probably wanted a promotion." Another replied, "These people always act like heroes when cameras are rolling." Amalia closed the browser. She turned off the phone. She lay back on the bed, eyes on the ceiling. That night, sleep didn't come. By morning, she received a message from the agency that had placed her at the estate. It was brief and final. "Due to recent events and employer concerns regarding boundaries and decorum, we are unable to recommend you for future placements at this time. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." Amalia stared at the screen. Her chest tightened. Her breathing slowed. Her fingers gripped the edge of the phone so hard that her knuckles went white. She had not only lost her job, she had lost her reputation in the circuit of elite domestic work. One whisper from a man like Drayton could end entire careers. And it had. The following hours passed in silence. Her mother tried to reassure her, but even Delilah's voice carried the tremble of uncertainty. Bills would come. Rent was due in 12 days. Maya still needed school supplies and bus fare. They had no backup plan. They never had. It was nearly dusk when the doorbell rang. They weren't expecting anyone. Amalia looked at her mother, who was just as puzzled. She opened the door slowly, cautiously. A woman stood there. She was tall, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a loose knot. Her clothing was simple dark slacks, a tailored coat, flat shoes, but everything about her posture and presence radiated poise. Her face was familiar, though Amalia couldn't place it immediately. Not until the woman spoke. "You're Amalia Brooks?" she asked softly. "Yes," Amalia replied, wary. "My name is Sylvia Drayton." Amalia blinked. Her mind reeled. She had heard the name once, maybe twice, whispered in the hallways of the estate. The sister of William Drayton, the black sheep, the one who had vanished from the family's public history years ago. Rumors had swirled mental illness, scandals, estrangement. The truth had never been spoken aloud. Sylvia offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "May I come in?" Amalia hesitated but opened the door wider. Inside, the three women sat around the small kitchen table. Sylvia accepted a cup of tea. Her hands were calm, her gaze steady. "I'm not here on behalf of my brother," she said. "I'm here because someone sent me a video. One of the kitchen staff filmed it on their phone. It shows you jumping into the pool, shows you saving Clara. It also shows my brother turning his back on both of you." Amalia stiffened. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Maya, who had been hovering in the hallway, stepped closer. Sylvia continued. "I was once part of that world. I know how easily they erase people like you. People like me, too, in a way. My brother didn't just cut me out of the business, he cut me out of the family, because I refused to sign off on something I knew was wrong. And I didn't have the power to stop him." Her voice did not waver, but it carried the weight of years. "I help women now," she said. "Women who've been discarded, overlooked. When I saw that video, I knew I had to find you." Maya looked down at her cup. Sylvia leaned forward, her voice low. "I don't want revenge. I want truth. And I want you to be able to tell it. Not for spectacle, not for clicks, but because it's yours." Amalia shook her head. What difference would it make? Sylvia held her gaze. It might not change him, but it might change something else. For you, for Clara, for others watching. Amalia didn't respond. Sylvia reached into her coat pocket and placed a business card on the table. This is someone I trust, an independent journalist. He doesn't work for the media elite. If you ever want to talk, he'll listen. She stood up. I'm not going to push you, she said, stepping toward the door. But I will say this. You shouldn't have been there according to them. But if you hadn't been, Clara would have drowned. So maybe you were exactly where you needed to be. And then she left. Amalia sat at the table long after the door closed. The business card remained on the wood, untouched. Outside, the sky turned indigo. Inside, Amalia's silence began to shift. Not to words, not yet, but to something that felt dangerously close to resolve. The card remained on the table for 2 days. Amalia didn't touch it, but she didn't throw it away either. She would glance at it every time she passed by the kitchen, black lettering on a plain cream background. Too simple to feel threatening, too clean to ignore. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Perhaps for the feeling of indignation to pass, or for the bitter taste of humiliation to soften into something she could speak about without trembling. But mostly she was waiting for the moment when silence stopped feeling like protection and started to feel like complicity. That moment came on the 3rd day. It arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a small, quiet shift. Her mother was asleep on the couch, exhausted from another day trying to stretch too little into enough. Her sister was at school, and the apartment was wrapped in stillness. Amalia sat at the table with a cup of lukewarm tea, the card in her hand at last. Her fingers brushed the numbers, not yet dialing. Her breath slowed. She knew that once she called, the words would no longer be hers alone. They would become part of a record, a statement, a risk. She called. The voice on the other end was gentle. Male, mid-30s by the sound of it, with the measured patience of someone who had spoken to people like her before, those who had something to say but didn't know how to begin. His name was Martin. He didn't ask for details right away. He offered to meet somewhere neutral, somewhere safe, a small public library in a neighborhood far enough from both the Drayton estate and her apartment that neither world would interfere. Amalia agreed. The meeting happened 2 days later. She arrived early wearing her plainest clothes and a cap pulled low over her forehead. Martin was already there, sitting near the back in a corner surrounded by shelves of biographies. He stood when she approached and greeted her with a nod, not a handshake. Respectful, careful. They sat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amalia told him everything. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She spoke plainly about the job, the estate, the culture of silence. About Clara, her quiet nature, the way no one ever listened to her. About the moment the child fell into the pool and how the world around her had frozen. She described the cold water, the weight of the little body in her arms, the moment Clara gasped and came back to life. And then she described what came next, the glares, the dismissal, the packed bag by the gate. Martin took notes, but he didn't interrupt. When she was finished, he closed his notebook gently. Would you allow me to record your story for publication? He asked. We can protect your identity, or we can use your name. That's up to you. Amalia hesitated. I don't want to be famous, as she said. You won't be, Martin replied, but you might be visible. She said yes. In the days that followed, Martin followed up with more questions about the working conditions, the contracts, the unwritten rules that governed everything. Amalia introduced him to another former employee from the estate, a gardener who had been fired after complaining about missing overtime pay. Then another, a young cook who had been let go after asking for a medical leave. The pattern emerged quickly. Anyone who spoke up was removed, quietly and without recourse. Word spread. Other voices emerged. Martin compiled the testimonies. He double-checked details, requested documents, researched the legal frameworks that allowed such quiet abuses to persist. He worked methodically and always with caution. Amalia appreciated that. She didn't want a war. She wanted clarity. Meanwhile, Sylvia Drayton returned. She called Amalia late one evening, asking if she could stop by. This time, Amalia didn't hesitate. She met her at the cafe near the apartment, And over 2 cups of weak coffee, Sylvia listened as Amalia recounted what she had done, what Martin had gathered, what others were beginning to say. Sylvia didn't hide her pride. "You've done more in 2 weeks than I managed in 2 years," she said. "I'm just telling the truth." "Yes," Sylvia replied, "but most people never do." Sylvia offered her further support, legal contacts, access to a small grant for rent assistance while she searched for new employment, a network of people who had once lived behind the velvet curtain and now used their knowledge to pull it back. Amalia accepted the help cautiously, never letting her guard down. But she no longer felt alone. Clara remained on her mind. She hadn't seen the girl since that day. She had no way of knowing how she was doing, whether she remembered what happened. But one morning, a letter arrived at the apartment. There was no return address. The handwriting was clumsy, uneven, printed in crayon. It said one word: "Thank you." Amalia stared at the paper for a long time. She showed it to no one. She folded it and placed it inside the back of her journal, where it remained like a pressed flower, a quiet reminder that some things were worth the cost. Then the article went live. Martin had chosen his platform carefully, an independent investigative site with a modest but loyal readership. The piece was long, detailed, methodical. It named no one directly at first. It described a culture of silencing, a pattern of retaliation against workers who dared to act with conscience. It told Amalia's story. It quoted others. It included timelines, legal precedents, and a careful disclaimer that every claim was backed by documentation or testimony. The story spread, not virally, not explosively, but steadily. People shared it. Other journalists referenced it. Workers from other estates wrote in with similar accounts. Advocacy groups reached out, offering support, asking for permission to use the article in workshops and trainings. Someone from a local college contacted Martin, requesting to include the case study in their labor ethics class. Amalia's name became known, but not as a scandal and not as a symbol, as a person. Then came the phone call from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. They wanted to honor her at an upcoming event, not as a hero, but as someone who had dared to step outside the lines drawn by others. Sylvia helped organize the logistics. Martin prepared a brief summary to be read aloud. The night of the event, Amalia stood backstage, palms damp, heart racing. The auditorium wasn't large, but it was full. She wasn't used to attention. She had spent most of her life trying not to be noticed. She didn't make a speech. She accepted the recognition with a small bow, then stepped aside for the next honoree. But afterwards, someone approached her in the crowd, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile. She introduced herself as a former housekeeper who had once been fired for speaking out about unsafe conditions. "I read what you said," the woman told her. "It made me feel less alone." That was when Amalia understood what Sylvia had meant. Truth was never about spectacle. It was about solidarity. Later that night, sitting on the edge of her bed, Amalia thought about Clara again, about the pool, about the moment she had stepped out of her lane and into the water, not knowing what would come next. She had lost her job, her income, her standing in the elite domestic world. But she had found something else. Her voice, her dignity, her place, not in their world, in her own. The applause from the auditorium still echoed faintly in Amalia's ears as she stepped out into the cool night. The street outside the Civic Center was quiet, but something inside her stirred, alert and alive. She had never imagined herself standing in front of a crowd. Even now, her voice hadn't joined the public conversation in the way others might have hoped. She hadn't given speeches or shouted into microphones, but her presence had been enough. People had listened, and more importantly, people had believed her. Sylvia waited beside the car, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The streetlights lit her face in golden shadow. When Amalia approached, Sylvia smiled, not with triumph, but with calm satisfaction. Not every war had to be won with banners. Some victories lived in silence, in small nods exchanged between those who understood. "I think that's the last ceremony I'll attend for a while," Amalia said, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Sylvia chuckled. "You did fine. I didn't say anything. You didn't need to." They drove in silence for a while, city lights blurring against the windows. Sylvia offered to take her home. But Amalia declined. She wanted to walk the last few blocks. She needed the air, the time to let everything settle in her mind. Back at the apartment, the hallway smelled of detergent and boiled rice. Her mother had left a plate covered in foil on the counter. Maya was already asleep. The house was ordinary, familiar, still too small, but it was theirs. The energy in the room had changed these past few weeks. Fear no longer occupied the space. In its place was something steadier, heavier. Awareness. The following morning, Sylvia called with news. A national newspaper had picked up Martin's story. They were doing a follow-up and wanted to include an interview with her. She wouldn't need to speak on camera, only to clarify some details, perhaps respond to the counterclaims that had started to circle. Because they had begun, of course. William Drayton's office issued a statement. It denied all wrongdoing. It cited privacy, misrepresentation, and unverified allegations. It painted Amalia as a well-meaning but overstepping employee who had compromised safety procedures. The statement made no mention of Clara, not a word. But then came the footage. The kitchen video, recorded discreetly by a staff member and preserved by Martin with the consent of those involved, was released to accompany the article's second installment. It was blurry but unmistakable. It showed the pool. It showed Amalia running, diving, pulling Clara from the water. It showed the moment William Drayton arrived, not with relief but fury. The public response was immediate. Not everyone was outraged. Some still clung to their assumptions. But more and more voices emerged to question the treatment Amalia had received. Commentators and columnists began analyzing the language of decorum and boundaries. The conversation shifted. And then quietly, another story broke. A former nanny, anonymously at first, then under her own name, published her account. Clara had been left unattended regularly, she said. She'd raised concerns privately, respectfully, but was dismissed for over-identifying with the child. She had signed an NDA and had stayed silent for years. Now she was done being silent. The momentum built. A petition circulated, not to punish anyone, but to recognize Amalia's actions officially. Support came from unexpected places, school teachers, nurses, even former staffers from the Drayton family's inner circle. One woman, a retired chef, wrote in a letter published by the Times, "She saved that child and they showed her the gate. If that isn't the definition of injustice, I don't know what is." At the same time, legal inquiries began to simmer beneath the surface. Advocacy organizations began asking more pointed questions about the labor practices of the Drayton Foundation. Sylvia, well-connected even in exile, passed on discreet messages. Investigations were quietly underway. Through it all, Amalia kept working, not in cleaning, but with Sylvia's foundation. She had begun organizing workshops for domestic workers, offering basic legal information, support networks, and shared spaces for story sharing. The office was small, the pay modest, but it was meaningful work. Every woman who sat in the circle and told her truth made the space feel more real. And then one Tuesday afternoon, a message arrived that caught her breath short. It was from a state-appointed guardian. Clara had been temporarily removed from her father's custody, pending an investigation into neglect. She had been placed in the care of a relative, someone who was familiar and trusted. The name was not spelled out, but Amalia understood. Sylvia had taken her in. Amalia's heart pounded as she read the last part of the message. Clara had asked for her. The visit was arranged quietly. No reporters, no cameras. Just a quiet room in Sylvia's home, filled with soft light and familiar toys. When Amalia entered, Clara was sitting on a cushion on the floor, tracing patterns with a colored pencil. She looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. Then she smiled not with her mouth, but with her entire face. Amalia knelt beside her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. From that day on, Amalia visited regularly. Sometimes they played with shapes or puzzles. Sometimes they just sat together. Clara grew more expressive, more confident. One afternoon, she picked up a crayon and wrote a full sentence in block letters. "I want to swim again." Amalia felt tears behind her eyes. Not of sadness, but of something deeper relief, maybe. Hope. Together with a child therapist, they developed a gentle plan to reintroduce Clara to the water. At first, it was just dipping toes into a tub, then walking by a public pool. Eventually, it would be more. Amalia didn't rush her. They had time now. Meanwhile, Sylvia's foundation grew. More women came forward, not just from the Drayton estate, but from other places, other names. The website added a section called Silent Histories, where stories were published, some with names, others anonymously. Each one was a testament. One evening, while reviewing drafts for the site, Sylvia turned to Amalia. "You know," she said, "we could call this series Saying Names Out Loud." Amalia looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," she said, "let's." The next morning, Amalia stood in front of a room of new workers. Some were young, some nearing retirement. All of them had once been told to keep their heads down. She introduced herself not as a hero, not as a cautionary tale, but simply as Amalia Brooks. A woman who had once been told she didn't belong in a certain place. A woman who had learned that being unseen was not the same as being invisible. She said it quietly but firmly. "I was a housekeeper. I am a worker. I am a witness, and I will not be erased." The room was still for a moment. Then came the nods, the tears, the hands reaching out, not for help, but for understanding. Later that week, an official letter arrived. It bore the seal of a national human rights organization. It invited Amalia to participate in a policy advisory committee on labor standards for domestic workers. Sylvia laughed when she read it aloud. "You're going to change laws now?" Amalia smiled. "Maybe just a few." That weekend, Amalia walked to the lake near the edge of the city. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. She sat on a bench, hands folded, watching the surface ripple with wind. She remembered the day she jumped into the pool. The chill, the weight, the silence. She remembered the words spoken as she was led away. "You shouldn't have been there." Now she said them aloud, not in anger, but with clarity. "I was there." And then for the first time, she said something else, something truer, deeper, unshakable. "And I belonged." Shiwaki. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives. Watch the next video to discover another unforgettable journey. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.